You can get started.
Great. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Jessica Berman, Director of the Drescher Center for the Humanities and Professor of English. We're really delighted to welcome you here virtually this afternoon. Today's event is part of the Fall 2022 Humanities Forum, a free public lecture series organized by the Drescher Center for the Humanities. And I'd like to just take a minute to share with you our next event in the series, which will take place next week on Thursday, October 27th, also at 4 p.m. For their annual Robert K. Webb lecture, the Department of History presents The Decade of Returns, Museum Curation After the Universal Museum. Dan Hicks, Professor of Contemporary Archaeology at the University of Oxford and also curator at the Pitt Rivers Museum, will speak, and he will speak about how museums around the world have begun to transfer ownership and make returns of looted African cultural heritage. What, he asked, does this mean for museums in Europe and North America? And in the talk, Hicks will take stock of a century of African demands for returns, the gradual evolution of professional ethical curatorial practice, and the opportunities and risks that lie ahead. As I said, the event will take place at 4 p.m. on October 27th, and it'll be in room 767 of the Kuhn Library Gallery, of the Kuhn Library, and will be live streamed as well. To learn more, I encourage you to look at the Drescher Center website, dreschercenter.umbc.edu, and you can also always connect with us on social media. Before we begin, I'd like to just make a couple of announcements. First, I want to acknowledge that UMBC was established upon the land of the Piscataway and Susquehannock peoples. Over time, citizens of many more indigenous nations have come to reside in this region. We humbly offer our respects to all past, present, and future indigenous people connected to this place. And while we recognize that acknowledging those who came before us is important, we also know that it's only a small gesture and that we must take action towards the necessary work of repair. Second, a word on process. We're going to take Q&A after the lecture today. We invite you to submit questions at any time during the talk in the Q&A chat box, and that's the particular Q&A, not just the regular chat. So to access the Q&A box, please click on the little three dots at the bottom right corner of your screen and select Q&A. The event this afternoon is being live streamed and it'll be made available on the UMBC YouTube page immediately after the event for those who might want it for their classes or might have friends who haven't been able to attend. And finally, I want to thank the Latinx and Hispanic Faculty Association for organizing today's event, particularly Tanya Munoz, Associate Professor in the Department of MLLI, who will introduce our speaker. Tanya.
Hi, everyone. Buenas tardes a todos. Good afternoon to all of you. And thank you for being here today. My name is Tania Munoz. I'm actually still an assistant professor, got for tenure this year, in the Department of Model Languages, Linguistics, and Intercultural Communication, better known as MLI at UMBC, where I teach Spanish, Latin American, and Latinx literature courses. I'm also a board member of the Executive Committee of the Latinx and Hispanic Faculty Association, which co-organized today's Humanities Forum talk, as Jessica mentioned, with the Drescher Center to celebrate Latinx Heritage Month here at UMBC. I feel privileged to be here to represent my colleagues, and I'm thankful every year we get to collaborate with the Drescher Center. Shout out to Courtney Hobson in planning our Latinx Heritage Month speaker. As you may know, Latinx Heritage Month runs from September 15th to October 15th in the US. So technically we're a few days over, but it doesn't really matter. And I recently read online something that said that Latinx Heritage Month may be over, but the work continues. I would like to add also that the celebration continues, particularly because I'm very excited to introduce today's speaker and to welcome her to our UMBC community. So Micha Cárdenas is a PhD, an artist, an associate chair, and an associate professor of performance, play, and design, and associate professor of critical race and ethnic studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where she directs the Critical Reality Studio. Her book, Poetic Operations, Duke University Press 2022, proposes algorithmic analysis as a method of developing a transcolor poetics. Poetic Operations just won the Gloria Anzaldúa Book Prize in 2022 for the National Women's Studies Association. Cárdenas co-authored books The Trans Rio, Political Aesthetics of Crossing Realities 2012, and Trans Desire, Affected Cyborgs 2010 were published by Atropos Press. She's currently working on her next academic monograph tentatively titled After Men, Fires, Oceans, and Androids, as well as in a multidisciplinary artwork about climate change's effects on the oceans, and a science fiction novel about the many worlds interpretations of quantum mechanics. She's a first-generation Colombian American. So please join me in welcoming Micha Cárdenas today. Thank you for being here, Micha.
Thank you so much, Tanya, for that introduction. And thanks to Courtney for all your work to make this event happen. And thanks to the Latinx and Hispanic Faculty Association. I'm really grateful, honored to be invited. So if I share my slides, if I do the full screen, can you see the slides still, Tanya? Great, okay. All right. So I do first want to acknowledge that the land that I'm on is the unceded territory of the Awaswas-speaking Yubi tribe. The Amamutsin tribal band, comprised of descendants of indigenous people taken to Mission Santa Cruz and San Bautista during Spanish colonization of the Central Coast, is today working hard to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands and heal from historical trauma. And this is really the foundation for this work, thinking about decolonization. How do we keep this struggle going through how do I keep this struggle going through my scholarship and think about decolonization, bringing that together to transgender studies, to digital studies, to performance studies and art. And yeah, here's the cover of the book. But I also wanted to share something from our workshop. We had a really amazing workshop earlier, and I'm really grateful to all the participants who came. I would invite you to put something in the chat or Q&A, but I don't think you can see each other's things, so I guess you can't raise your hand. But anyway, I honor you for showing up. And we did this, I asked, who do you want to call in the room? And everybody said some amazing things, so I wanted to read a little what I wrote during our free write in the workshop. Calling in the ancestors. We call in the cat, the will, the hunger, the animal. We call in the huelga, Dolores, the strikers, the organizers. We call in the monsters, the hybrids, the vampires, the androids. We call in the mothers, the grandmothers, the abuelas, the struggle, care. We create this space, we breathe together, we look in each other's eyes, we share pain and laughter. Be whatever you want. Have 1,000 boyfriends or girlfriends. Be any gender. We thrive, stretch towards joy, searching for each other. Yes, so sort of co-written a little bit with everybody in the workshop. And when I asked everybody, who do you want to bring in the room, I said I wanted to bring in Gloria Anzaldúa, one of my absolute biggest inspirations in my work. And she's a queer, sort of non-binary before the term non-binary, chronically ill, Chicana feminist. And I'm really humbled to have won this award named after her for this book. So the acknowledgement of the book is for May, Judy, and chosen families everywhere. May was my foster daughter. She lives with her bio family now. Judy's my mom. She passed in 2020. And chosen family everywhere, I think essential to my survival, chosen family. So that's the acknowledgement, and really the context of a lot of my work in the last couple of years is working through grief. And that's, again, one of the questions that we talked about in the workshop. How do we work with and through grief and loss with the pandemic? So a big motivating factor in the book is to think about movement and process, to move away from categories and to move towards movement. um, and so the focus on operations there comes from that, thinking about um, an operator. An operator is the smallest component of an algorithm, like a plus sign, like A plus B equals C. The plus sign is the operator. So it's a symbol that stands for an action or an activity that you do. And I think this is really important, learning from Claudia and Zaldúa, women of color feminism, that women of color feminism is not about an identity that's given to you. It's a political action that you do, that you take part in or not. So it's a book about trends of color art and digital media. So I'm going to start. I'll read you a bit from the beginning of writing about this artwork, DNI, by Giuseppe Camposano. And then I'll talk about some of the other examples in the book. And then I will talk about my newer writing about trans ecologies and queer oceans. How much time do I have? Sorry, I should know that. I think I probably have like 30 minutes left. Maybe Courtney or Tanya could tell me.
You have about like 40 minutes.
Or 40 minutes left. Okay, great. Done. Okay. So, I'll excerpt from the beginning of Poetic Operations about this artwork. Turn your head and her gender changes. Her exquisitely unruly face, scarlet hair framing her gracefully arched eyebrows, is pictured in a shifting hologram on a neon pink ID card. Depending on the angle at which you look at the Peruvian artist Giuseppe Camposano's artwork DNI, or De Natura Incertus, a manufactured national ID card, the sex marker shifts from M to T for travesti, and the image of his face changes. I alternate pronouns for Giuseppe, following the method of Malo Machica Rose, who worked closely with Giuseppe. The work performs the gesture of shifting optics by using a lenticular printing technique. Lenticular prints are those things you've maybe seen on like a 7-Eleven cup where you look at it, or a trading card, you look at it from different angles and it shifts different images like a hologram. Lenticular prints are used for holograms because they rely on the shifting of the viewer that corresponds to a change of image and can be used to present the illusion of a three-dimensional image. DNI is Camposano's national ID card. It's like a passport and real ID combined. A requirement for every Peruvian citizen older than 18 digitally modified to display an image of him in drag with a T gender marker. The gesture of a forged DNI is additionally subversive in that many travestis do not have access to a DNI card. Camposano's project was presented at the 2014 Sao Paulo Biennial. The title of the artwork uses the initials of Peru's Documento Nacional de Identidad, or National Identity Document, and reimagines it with the Latin phrase de natura incertus, or roughly translated to of uncertain nature. Camposano's DNI uses the algorithmic media of identification cards to simultaneously call into question ideologies of binary gender, national identity, and immigration. In Camposano's work, a trans of color survival strategy is made through a poetic subversion of the algorithms of immigration control technologies. The rest of the card is intact, from the background image of a vicuña as a national symbol of Peru, to the seemingly random numbers and less than signs common to passports today that make their data more easily readable by electronic scanners. I alternate gender pronouns throughout the text to linguistically represent Camposano's gender fluidity. Following the method used by Malo Machica Rose, who I cite later in the chapter, I said that already. By digitally cutting and stitching the image of her national ID card with this performative image of her female gender presentation and the letter T for travesti, Camposano uses art and performance to gesture to speculative possibilities of subversions of gender regulation. Camposano creatively hacks identification and migration control algorithms, subverting them with what I call transitive color operations of cutting, shifting, and stitching. These operations are evident from cutting out of the photos of her face to the shifting of lenticular images, the digitally stitching together images, and the elaborate costumes she creates for these images. Cutting is an operation that helps identify parts of an algorithm, but one should imagine cuts not so much as an absolute separation as definitions for spaces of interaction. So cutting was the first operation I was thinking about in this book. We read Life After New Media in Kara Keeling's grad seminar at USC, and that book really delves into the cut as a operation proposed by Deleuze and Guattari to apply to media and also used by Jacques Derrida extensively. But I was thinking about practice-based research, thinking about how to theorize my art practice and what I was doing. At the time I was working on wearable electronics, and so I wanted to theorize the actual gestures I was using with fabric, cutting, stitching, shifting, folding fabric, and stitching circuits and electronics into that. And I'll show one of those works. The parts or variables shift over time. The parts of an operation, the parts of a process or a problem or an identity. Stitching is the operation of attaching various parts together, which is essential to both intersectionality and assemblage. The identification and elaboration of these poetic operations, cutting, stitching, and shifting, is central to my analysis and continues throughout the book. Campesano is reaching here not for simple visibility or invisibility, but for a holographic body that can shift and change with the movement of the viewer. The emphasis on movement is decolonial, as Western modes of knowing emphasize the primacy of the visual over embodied movement. Cameroonian theorist Achille Mbembe has described the optics of our necropolitical moment in terms of hologramization to allow for invisible killings. While Mbembe is speaking about three-dimensional maps that the military uses of occupied Palestine, the Israeli military uses of occupied Palestine, the forms of visibility he describes have far-reaching relevance for communities targeted by racial and gender violence worldwide. Transitive color poetics goes beyond binaries of visible and invisible, using methods, like holograms, that rely on movement more than visuality. In this book, I argue that by using algorithmic analysis to consider artworks that contribute to safety for trans people of color, survival strategies can be perceived, and from these strategies emerges the transitive color poetics, a repertoire of poetic operations. Poetics, whether of language, media, or movement, are the observable meeting points of matter and agency. While for Aristotle, poetics describe the essential qualities of a good poem, for the Caribbean theorist Edward Glissant, poetics are an expressive material force that flows with political impact between people and cultures. That's what the book says, but in my recent writing, I add and geographies. So I want to pause there for a second and say this was the topic of our workshop today, and had such fruitful discussions about algorithmic analysis and transitive color poetics, and really thinking about an algorithm just as a series of steps, like a recipe or a ritual. Algorithms are far older than digital technology, and so I asked the workshop participants to think about and to free write. What are the algorithms of survival that you use every day? Folks talked about things like riding their bike or cooking or, COVID protocols. All really, really beautiful, important algorithms of survival and practices that people are using. But then the later part of the book, thinking about stitching solidarity, the last chapter, I really trying to think more about collectivity. How do we make solidarity more than a word? And what we talked about in the workshop is this question of, how do we survive together? What are the algorithms or practices that we can use to survive together? Well, either that we are using, whether they're working or not, or what one that we can use. And that's what I really urge to the workshop participants and everybody listening now to continue that conversation, because it's so essential for us to work together to survive the pandemic and right-wing attacks on trans people, and so many things. Right-wing attacks on immigrants and Latinx people, so essential for us to take care of each other in a real concrete way these days. And that was a big motivating factor behind the book. Where am I at? 31, okay. So the main focus of the book is the poetics of artwork made by trans people of color working in digital media, a body of work that's been untheorized. The artworks I discuss all contribute, most explicitly and a few implicitly, to reducing violence against trans people of color by interrupting colonial control of embodiment, by modulating perceptibility, fostering transformation, and building solidarity. Here's one of my artworks that I discussed in the book that I mentioned earlier. So local autonomy networks was, it started with these wearable electronics. I had been working on the transborder immigrant tool, which is in the slides here somewhere. I have been working as an MFA student for years with the Electronic Disturbance Theater on this project called the Transborder Immigrant Tool to take cheap cell phones off of eBay and write software for them to help people find water in the US-Mexico border to prevent people from dying of dehydration. Because that was still the #1 cause of death at the time in the border was dehydration. And we really wanted to spur dialogue about this and really make the point that if someone's dying in the desert, the thing to do is not to ask them for their papers, but to give them water. So this collaboration, it started, I think, in 2007, really inspired me to think about how I could work as an artist to build safety for communities that I felt a part of, feel a part of, like trans people of color, trans women of color, queer people of color. So I made these mesh networked clothing and hoodies and bracelets and dresses that had electronics in them. They had wireless transmitters in them, so that if you were experiencing violence, you could press a button on your hoodie and it would send out a wireless signal to anybody else who had one of these garments, anybody else in your local safety network, and alert them that you need help. The initial ones were like wires everywhere and lots of lights, and I immediately started doing workshops with them and talking to queer and trans people of color in different cities about these. And that was like a community-based design process I discuss in the book. But immediately the feedback was, "That's cool that you can make $100 hoodie, but if I had $100, I'd buy a smartphone." So it really shifted the project. Part of the feedback also that came out of working with this community organization, Strong and Beautiful in Detroit, was the hoodies need to look more like a regular hoodie, not like some sci-fi thing with wires and lights everywhere, because it'll bring more attention to us. So that's how this design came about. All the electronics were sewn into the seams. There's a photo of it in the book, and it only had these subtle lights around the hood that turn on when you enabled the garment. But I quickly changed the direction of that project to focusing on really having these concrete conversations about survival, about how might we learn from a wireless network and embody that with just our bodies and our actions and our verbal and nonverbal communication. So I did workshops in 11 cities in 4 countries. This one was in Sao Paulo, Brazil, at the Hemispheric Institute of Performance and Politics. It's the image from the cover. This was a 3-day workshop of doing theater of the oppressed, talking about what kinds of violence people face on a daily basis and what we could do collectively as a community to reduce that violence or prevent it. And then doing performative kind of exercises, theater of the oppressed exercises, and creating this performance piece to actually practice sort of gathering and dispersing in public, and to practice flocking. And we created these movements together and shared them. And You know, I think I can show you the digital companion to the book, which includes a video of that work that's on the cover. So this is the digital companion. I made it in this e-publishing ebook software called Scalar that I worked on when I was at USC. SCALAR. It's a free software to make digital books and digital companions. So if you look at the digital companion, there's a link. The book tells you the link to it, but also here's the link if you want to look at it. It starts with this kind of mapping, chapter mapping and mapping of examples. So you can click and drag to see different examples, and you can zoom in or zoom out. There's a legend, or there's instructions. Anyway, you can zoom in or zoom out to see the different examples in the book. So this shows you the intro is about algorithmic analysis. Chapter 1 talks more about linguistic poetry and transitive color poetics. And then the next 3 chapters go through the operations of cutting, decolonial cut, the shift, and the experience of shifting, the next 4 chapters, and the stitch. And concluding with visionary transitive color futures. So let me see, there's a video here. Yes, okay, so I'll show you a short excerpt of this video. I'm not sure that I shared audio. I'm gonna stop sharing and share again and make sure I share audio. Share computer audio. Okay. I'm not going to share audio because it wants me to install drivers. All right, we're not going to hear audio. There's not really audio in this performance anyway. There's just the background sounds in the street. So I'll show you a short excerpt of this work, and I'll skip to the where the camera is.
Micha, if you want to link the website in the chat, and then maybe when people have time, they can.
Yes.
Have time.
Okay. Thanks. Great idea. Okay. That was just a short excerpt of that. And yeah, I can put the URL for the video in the chat. Great. Thank you. So yeah, it turned out to be a really quiet performance. The performance was called "We Already Know and We Don't Yet Know" because we were thinking we already know what violence is like in our bodies, but we don't know what it might feel like to have a world without prisons. You know, to feel safe and free every day on a daily basis on the street. And partly we were responding to the fact that that year we were in Sao Paulo, and that year Brazil was the #1 country in terms of number of murders of trans people. I think the number was 123 trans people murdered in Brazil that year. Sort of a performance of mourning also. All the participants were invited to say anything or make any noise they wanted to, but they all wanted to, for it to be a silent performance. So in other chapters in the book, I talk about video games, digital games. So especially in chapter 4, I talk about the experience of shifting. And I write about this game My Nietzsche by Maddie Bryce. It's called My Nietzsche, which means every day in Japanese. She said she called it that because she's using this JRPG, or Japanese role-playing game, sort of format for the game. And she used this software called RPG Maker. So this is a video game that she didn't have to write any code to make, but she still constructed an algorithm by, clicking and dragging things and orders and using some software to make another algorithm. So in this game, a really simple, short 5-minute game, I encourage everybody to play it online. You wake up in the morning and you are this Black trans woman, this little pixel avatar, and you try to go get coffee with a friend without experiencing violence. And spoiler alert, there is different racialized and gendered violence in the game. Part of what I talk about, why this is to me one of the clearest examples of algorithmic poetics, algorithmic analysis of trans of color poetics, is it's an algorithm about daily survival strategies, and at the end of the game, there's no you win, you lose. You get to the end and then it just starts over, and then you try again and you get to the end and it just starts over. And to me, it's a beautiful example of using algorithms to make the point that the violence goes on and on and on, and the player has to just walk away. But also the player, through that practice of repetition, learns the algorithm to avoid violence and to get to coffee safely, hopefully. And this was one of my main motivations for this book, was really to call attention to Black trans women, trans Latinas, trans people of color experiencing violence on a daily basis. And in 2014 was when Laverne Cox was on the cover of Time magazine, and the Pose TV show came out soon after that, and Janet Mock published her book. There's a lot of visibility for trans women of color. And what we saw was that year, 2014, the number of murders went up by 50%. So it seemed like this strategy of visibility that social movements have demanded for so long is not so simple. And, like I think Foucault talked about, or definitely has talked about in Trapdoor, the anthology, visibility, many people know that visibility is a trap. And so what I was thinking in this book about was other, holographic visibility, the demand to be able to control our visibility, to be visible when we want and not invisible when we want to do that. So yeah, my Nietzsche, one of my favorite examples in the book. Okay, I showed that. So also in chapter 4, I discuss my game Redshift and Portal Metal. It's an online digital game. You can Google it for the URL, or the URL is in the digital companion, which I put in the chat earlier. And it starts, I was really inspired by other trans women making text-based video games, twine games, like Maddie Bryce, like Porpentine and Ananthropy. And it starts with a simple screen, your planet is dying. Do you stay and help, or go to the ice planet? And the user can click on one of those choices, and then you get more poems and video excerpts. Yeah, so it's about the intersection of climate change and decolonization and race and gender. It's basically a story about this trans woman who goes to an icy planet, and it was really about my experience of moving to Toronto and having grown up in Miami and then gone to grad school in LA and San Diego. Then moving to Toronto was shocking. Living through snow and feeling like, oh my God, I live on an ice planet. So I started writing poems about that. and creating movement pieces to go with it. So the background of all the pages of that game are video and performance, because I wanted to kind of extend what people were doing in that genre with more performance. Okay, so let me switch gears a bit to this is Raven Wings, my dance teacher and collaborator, and she, Two-Spirit Mohawk artist, collaborated with me, performed with me one of the performances of Redshift, the performance that we did in Toronto. So I do want to say more about my recent work, my new book, After Man, Fires, Oceans, and Androids, is really thinking about the dual crises that we're facing of COVID and climate change. And the question that some people were asking at the beginning of COVID, which is this the end of humanity? And I had an editor already say in an article that was hyperbolic to ask that question or something. But also when talking about climate change, so many people are using this language. So the Oak Fire in California from this summer, Al Gore saying civilization is at stake. Or when the IPCC report came out, the UN was saying, and this is code red for humanity. And even just with the temperatures that we're facing with climate change, people saying, the heat wave in India and Pakistan this summer testing the limits of human survivability. So let me read a little bit of that new introduction to my new book, and then that can lead us into questions. Let me stop the sharing. I think it's sharing two windows. It doesn't like that.
What are you trying to share?
I guess I don't need it. I was trying to share a slide while I read some of the text. I don't need to. I'll just read.
Okay.
Okay. So yeah, I love feedback on the intro that I'm writing now. So this is After Man. My heart breaks again. My heart breaks for Sheikh Jarrah for Palestine. My heart breaks for Makia Bryant, for Dante Wright, for Adam Toledo. But most of all, my heart breaks for the foster baby who was in my care for 9 months, who's gone to live with an extended family member. From this heartbreak I write. The grief of each of these events reverberates off each other, generating an even deeper pain, but also creating constellations. The slowly unfolding tragedy of the news our baby was leaving came just around the time of the current explosion of Israeli violence against Sheikh Jarrah in Palestine. After being confined at home for over a year due to shelter-in-place orders to prevent the spread of COVID-19, I watched with rage and grief as Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah were being evicted from their homes by Israeli settlers, being denied the simplest human need, shelter. It's clear that as parts of the world receive the COVID-19 vaccine and return to some sense of normalcy, that normalcy is the horror of colonial racial capitalism and ecological catastrophe. In March 2020, human societies around the globe ground to a halt as shelter-in-place orders required billions of people to stay indoors to stop the spread of the novel coronavirus causing COVID-19. The possibility of an end of human society became real, as well as the possibility of global solidarity. Yet, as the virus is beginning to be better understood and fought back by multiple vaccines, societies are reopening. With those reopenings, the horrors of ethnic cleansing, police murder, global anti-Blackness, and mass shootings mark our return to normal. This moment's been claimed by activists around the world as a moment to move closer to liberation, to abolition, to freedom from colonial violence. This book asks what new possibilities for justice might be imagined if we move past the limitations of ethics and politics that depend on a claim to humanity. If we acknowledge that the concept of the human has always been a weapon to define who is killable, Through the following chapters, this book considers the markers of what makes us human, identifies how each of those markers has been surpassed, what new possibilities lie beyond. In September 2021, the medical journal The Lancet made headlines worldwide with the article, Climate Change, Fires, Floods, and Infectious Diseases. The article pointed to numerous studies supporting the claim that climate change will result in more and more frequent outbreaks of infectious disease like COVID-19. Using abolitionist, intersectional feminist, and algorithmic methods, this book focuses on the actions that can be taken to work not just for sustainability, but for global justice. I consider poetics and aesthetics of art and activism that can gesture beyond what Jamaican Black cultural theorist Sylvia Wynter has described as the horizon of man. After man takes a systemic global approach to respond to the challenges facing humanity following Sylvia Wynter and asking if humanity is coming to an end, or if it has already ended, or if it ever was. Many of us never had the privilege of being considered human. Looking at contemporary art and global art exhibitions in the time of COVID-19, this book asks, what is the role for art and humanities in a time in which many have asked if we're seeing the horizon of humanity? What emerges is a clearer picture of the stakes of socially engaged art that is decolonial, socially engaged, and in dialogue with activist movements. The urgency of climate change is described by Sylvia Wynter as a species-threatening event. She cites Jacques Derrida's talk, The Ends of Man, in which he applies his deconstructive method to the language of man. Wynter distinguishes between the referent we of man, as used by French philosophers, and the human species itself. So Wynter's distinguishing there, and following on Derrida, distinguishing there between when the word man is used, who is it referring to? Or when the word humanity is used. She calls on readers to see the many struggles for racial, gender, and economic justice as wrapped up in this single issue. Wynter says, the referent we of man and of its ends, he implies, is not the referent we of the human species itself. Yet, as Derrida says, French philosophers have assumed that as middle-class philosophers, their referent we, that of man too, is isomorphic with the referent we in the horizon of humanity. I'm saying here, this is still Wynter, that the above is the single issue with which global warming and climate instability now confronts us, that we have to replace the ends of the referent we of liberal monohumanist man too, with the ecumenically human ends of the referent we in the horizon of humanity. We have no choice. Ooh, that's a dense quote. Let's see if I can unpack it. She differentiates between the people signified by the word man in a sense shaped by religion and Western Enlightenment philosophy and the actual extent of human beings, calling to our attention the ways that many groups of people have been dehumanized. Black people, trans people, poor people, indigenous people, women, immigrants, Latinx people, to name a few. Instead, she calls on thinkers and activists to refigure the word human as an action, a verb, not a noun, saying with, quote, with being human, everything is praxis. With this focus on action, human is something we do, not something we are. In considering how we make this huge shift towards saving all of humanity instead of only the privileged few from climate catastrophe, Sylvia Wynter points to the codes that define us. Learning from Frantz Fanon's concept of sociogenesis, she describes, quote, our hybrid sociogenic codes and their second set of instructions. Here, algorithmic analysis is useful in seeing that if the concept of the human is shaped by codes that are both social and biological, those codes are algorithms which can be analyzed and changed. They can be hacked. Wynter herself states, these are codes that are even able to override, where necessary, the first set of instructions of our own DNA. So I'm trying in this book to consider the codes which currently define the limits of the human, to look to artists and theorists who offer strategies to override those codes in order to avert planetary catastrophe for all species. So some of the artists that I'm looking at in that book are, is that window? Okay. I mean, important to note the evidence is everywhere of trans people not being considered human. Writers like Alejandro Caballo tweeted just a couple of weeks ago, you know, these right-wing people trying to stop trans people from getting hormones, stop trans people from participating in public life, are doing that because they know that the result is death. Alejandro Caballo says they don't see us as human. So all these trans kids in Virginia, queer and trans and non-binary kids who have a school system now that says that you're not allowed to talk about pronouns or share pronouns, are all people not seen as human by people trying to change those things. So getting towards the end, I think I have 6.5 minutes left. So some of the artworks that I talk about in this book are my work, Seen Soul. It was a big collaborative work. So I worked with artists, that is a typo. I worked with a number of artists on this in my studio, the Critical Reality Studio. So Aviva Avnisan did the 3D scans of the forest that are the backdrop for the game. And that were the backdrop in the museum and gallery installations. Marcelo Villaneto did the 3D modeling of Aura, the main character, the trans-Latina AI. Adrian Phillips and Kara Stone also worked on 3D modeling support. Dorothy Santos is a grad student at UCSC who worked on production. Wayne Greenwood, a sound artist, musician, who worked on one of the songs in the soundtrack. I made most of the songs in the soundtrack. And some other undergrad students worked on character design. Morgan Thomas iterated this character design with me, and Rachel Raymond and Robin Cruz made the prototype. So it's a multidisciplinary artwork, Seen Soul, that includes poetry and dance and installation and augmented reality. The one that's probably most accessible to you right now is the augmented reality app. It's on the Apple App Store. It's like $3 or $4 or something. And you can download it and play it. It needs to be played in a wide open space, like in a park. So the viewer will walk around with their iPad or iPhone in real physical space. It's augmented reality. So the virtual objects are placed in real space. And once you get close enough, you see Aura move, dance, say poetry to you. I've also shown it at a number of museums and galleries and at the Thessaloniki Biennial. But also thinking about work by Ursula Beeman. So Ursula Beeman made this project called Acoustic Ocean, Installation and Film. Really beautiful film. There's short excerpts online. Beautiful film about indigenous Sami scientist pictured here. And you see her extending out hydrophones and listening to undersea creatures. Ursula says that this work is also sound artwork. So you hear the sounds of whales and many different species in that work. And she talks about the many harmful effects of climate change on the oceans, like the destruction of pteropods. So very, very small, almost microscopic animals, like the ones pictured here, are essential to the food chain because larger animals eat them, and they're being destroyed by ocean acidification. Because carbon dioxide going into the ocean in millions of tons is making the ocean more acidic and is literally destroying the shells of very small animals like this. Of course, the sea level rise has so many other effects, like hurricanes, that are just completely defying human attempts at building architecture. So this was in Puerto Rico, September 24th. Hurricane Fiona, again, hitting Puerto Rico and just destroying the human infrastructure there. And this was, of course, Hurricane Ian, also destroying bridges in so many parts of Florida. So sea level rise, and a part of climate change, causing these massive effects, and artists making work about that. And to wrap up, I'll just say a bit about another one of my works that I discuss in the forthcoming book, Oceanic. So Oceanic is a collaboration between myself, Gerald Cassell, Cynthia Ling Lee, Susana Ruiz, and Huey Trong. And this work is referring back to Gloria Anzaldúa. So Gloria wrote an essay about Natural Bridges Beach. She lived here, she taught here, she was a student here at UCSC, and she wrote this beautiful essay called Unnatural Bridges, in parentheses, Unnatural Bridges, Unsafe Spaces. And she's writing about the change in geography here, about how one of these bridges collapsed during an earthquake. And she compares that to the changes in social movements and women of color feminism. And this essay is the first essay that I know of in which women of color feminists started to talk about trans women of color and include trans women of color in women of color feminism. So really important to me and to the movements, I think. So in this work, Oceanic, we've been researching this for a year now, and a lot of it is thinking about grief and loss and how do we work through grief and loss. This beach was the beach that I took my foster daughter to. The first time she ever touched the ocean was here. And one of my collaborators is also dealing with long COVID, like 18 million other people in the United States, and dealing with the loss of capacity. Thinking about how to dance and build art through that. And I think that for me, one of the most important outcomes of this project was in the way that we made it, in the way that we prioritize disability justice and accessibility first. Everything about from where we shot on the beach to how long the dance pieces were to how we worked together was shaped around accessibility needs of my collaborators. So I'd like to end with just showing a short clip from that video, and then we can have some discussion. Apologies that this is not up. I got a little confused with the Windows and WebEx, but oh, there won't be sound either, and I'm out of time anyway. I'll show a short clip that won't have sound, keep it short, and then we can have discussion. Bridges are thresholds to other realities, archetypal primal symbols of shifting consciousness. They are passageways, conduits, and connectors that connote transitioning, crossing borders, and changing perspectives. Bridges span liminal threshold spaces between worlds, spaces I call Nepantla, a Nahuatl word meaning tierra entre medio. Could y'all hear that quote? I think maybe you could hear it through the microphone.
Yes, we could hear it.
Excellent. Yes, that first quote is from Gloria Anzaldúa, as specified in the credits of the film. The shoal is a small uncovered spot of sand, coral, or rock where one must quickly gather, lose oneself, or proceed in a manner and fashion not yet known. In a temporal sense, the shoal is also the location that offers a moment to reassemble the self as an amphibious and terrestrial subjectivity. Not just water, fluid, malleable, and fungible, but also a body landed. Hortense Spiller's notion of the oceanic, Edward Glissant's archipelagic thought, Thai dialectics, rhythm, Black Atlantic, queer Atlantic, Caribbean discourse, in the wake, poetics of landscape, peculiar dawn ritual, sandy situation, errant movement.
A particularly shifty formation, a shoal can erode over time, drift, and eventually accumulate in another location. Its unpredictability exceeds full knowability, mappability.
Okay, I'll stop there. Those quotes were from Tiffany Lethabo King's book, The Black Shoals, which also we put in the credits of the film. Okay, yeah, I'll stop there for Q&A. I think we have time for Q&A, I hope.
Yes, we are. Thank you so much, Misha. My name's Courtney Hobson. I am program coordinator for the Gesture Center for the Humanities. I'm going to be moderating our Q&A. Once again, please type your questions into the Q&A box, or if you cannot find that, you can also put it in chat as well. I will be monitoring that. I saw that someone raised a hand. With this webinar format, you're going to have to type in your question. We're not able to bring you on to the screen. So we have a question from Carla Mainsa. They ask, where do you find, if you like to share, your own algorithms of resistance and solidarity?
Oh yeah, thanks, Carla, and thanks for coming to the workshop. um, that's a good question. I think that I mean, a lot of my work starts with writing poetry or just like free form writing. Um, so like with Oceanic, with Scene Soul, with Redshift and Portal Metal, all those works started with me writing about difficult things. Um, Writing about things that feel insurmountable or incomprehensible. And then, over time, writing more, thinking about it more. Yeah.
Okay, sorry, I'm just putting something in the chat. Just a reminder to everyone, if you were able to join us right at the beginning, this talk is being recorded and it will be shared on the line on our YouTube. I'm putting a link to our YouTube channel in the chat, but I'll also email everyone who has joined us today. Are there any additional questions?
I do want to say that I'm sad that I couldn't be there in person today, but I think it's really essential that we continue to be streaming our events and make them accessible for disabled communities and immunocompromised people and resist going back to normal. I think it is essential that we don't go back to the normal because it was not normal.
Yes, I'm constantly trying to figure out ways to make that happen. So I 100% agree with you. I think all of our events for the forum, if we have permission from the speaker, we always try to have them, if not streamed, then recorded in some capacity. So Jessica Berman has a question. She asks, I love that you are drawing on Sylvia Wynter. Her work is underread. Can you say more about why you go to her work?
Yeah, I do talk about winter a bit in Poetic Operations. I kind of discovered her work later though. Once I was well, it was like when I took that seminar with Kara Keeling, she introduced me to Glissant. I think it was through Glissant that I learned about winter because they're both Caribbean writers. Um, but also I remember, frankly, like there was some sort of like celebratory lunch event at the National Women's Studies Association about Sylvia Wynter, and I probably went there as a hungry grad student looking for lunch, or maybe as a hungry first year professor looking for lunch. But then like learned how much people love Sylvia Wynter and started reading her, and I feel like she just has this incredibly expansive vision where she's getting to really foundational questions. And yeah, sometimes her writing is really dense, but I just find that she's the person I most want to be thinking with. I mean, her and Catherine McKittrick's writing with her and about her, so inspiring. Yeah. And, I mean, the phrase after man is from Sylvia Wynter, and, she was thinking also about these questions about um, humanity, the political stakes of humanity, and pointing out how central those are.
Okay, another question comes from Yolanda Valencia. You mentioned the idea of the human. I wonder if you can expand a bit more about how we might be able to center other stories of humanity that might be geared towards collective survival.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think I mean, I think there's many questions, like a question of how we frame our scholarship and how we frame our activism and what language we use and what questions we're asking. So to answer your question, I think many different strategies come to mind. I think about Sylvia Wynter's essay, No Humans Involved, which was the code that police would use in their reports when they had violence against sex workers, or people of color. They would say no humans involved. And she, in that essay, really calls us to think about what we're doing in academia that could allow a category like human to be created and used against people in such a way. So she really points the finger to academics and to what exactly we're doing when we use the word human, or when we say this is what the humanities means, or this is the pinnacle of humanity, or how we define human. So watching Democracy Now! This morning and seeing that there was one of the January 6th rioters was just convicted, and he was carrying a flag for a white supremacist organization, which he helped found at UCLA. So really thinking about what are we doing as scholars, as people running a university, as having any part in running a university and space, and what are we doing to make sure that Black people, Indigenous people, Latinx people are seen as human? But also, I think in terms of activism, last night I was looking at this some big corporate response to climate change. John Doerr's book, Speed and Scale. It's a list of like 6 things to do. Literally, it's a picture of a napkin. Like, that's so cool to have a napkin with your ideas on it. 6 points on how to fix the climate. And it was like electrify transportation, decarbonize the grid, protect nature, blah blah blah, for a few other things. Nowhere in there did it say protect humans, protect people. I was baffled by how this person could talk about protecting nature and not talk about protecting humans. So I think that's essential as we think about stopping climate change, or other movements. But as we think about stopping climate change, I think it's essential that we think about how climate change is intersectional, how it's disproportionately harming and killing immigrants and people of color and women and queer and trans people around the world already. Yeah.
Okay. A question from Cliff Watson. Cliff says, thank you, Dr. Cardenas. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the application of your algorithmic and performance studies practice models to more public or mass performance practices. I'm thinking about the circus in particular, since I have a trans child professionally involved in that world, but perhaps you have an answer with respect to other fields.
Yeah, thank you. In chapter 2 on the cut is where I talk more extensively about that performance that I showed, the We Already Know and We Don't Yet Know, which was public performance. And I try to think there about how I'm particularly thinking there about the cut and how public performance cuts into public space, and the cut there as a kind of interruption, and how it can cut into public space by using like time and tempo and speed, but also using appearance. If like the performers are wearing certain costumes, if they're all wearing the same thing, or if they're wearing something that's not very everyday, right, it can cut into the public space in a way. And another thing I talk about in that chapter is cutting the way that performance can cut or interrupt police surveillance networks, because in many cities, and definitely in Sao Paulo, there are surveillance cameras on the street used by the police, and algorithms hooked up to those surveillance cameras to detect abnormal movement and to try to find criminality by finding abnormal movement. So part of what I argue there is that that's a function that public performance can have, to disrupt those networks, to introduce abnormal movement, to exploit the algorithms that they're using and undermine and reveal the flawed ideas in those algorithms. I mean, like, a basic argument in the book is that people thinking about race and gender should but think about algorithms can benefit by thinking about algorithms, and also that people thinking about algorithms and writing algorithms should be thinking about race and gender, that all these things are intertwined, that so often these systems like computer vision systems are designed based on flawed colonial binary gender assumptions, like software that determines are you male or female. Wrong. You're just asking the wrong question from the beginning. Wrong. There's so many more genders. It's just starting with flawed assumptions, getting flawed data. And similarly with climate change, I'm trying to, restate the argument that others have made that we can't have climate justice without gender justice and racial justice.
All right, another question from Eli. Eli says that they joined a little late, but they are curious if your theorization of the oceanic interacts with the spirit of NYC's old meatpacking district and the many queer and trans communities that were formed around the Hudson River piers.
Oh, wow. No, I don't know anything about that. It's about Natural Bridges Beach in California. It's about this specific beach in California. But definitely something to think about because we are showing it in New York in March at the Leslie Lohman Museum. So I appreciate that. I don't see that question anywhere.
Yeah, it's kind of weird with where it puts the questions.
Okay.
Hold on, my cat is being a cat right now.
Read the next question.
Okay, next question from Tanya Lissarasso. She asks, we tend to imagine the digital as more democratic, but your approach allows us to consider the digital gap and also the embodied knowledge that exceeds the digital. Can you talk a little bit more about the embodied knowledge of survival?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. Yeah. Yeah, when I started working on this book, I was thinking a lot more about digital media and performance. And then as I was writing it, this whole, like I mentioned in the workshop, as I was writing it, this sort of field of algorithmic studies emerged, algorithm studies. So Sophia Noble's book, Algorithms of Oppression, amazing book about how Google profits off of racism, or artificial unintelligence or automating inequality, all these excellent books with critiques of algorithms and AI that I think are really important and people should understand. But I was trying to do something different in my book than critique, which is why I focused on transitive color poetics and rather than transitive color critique, because I wanted to. I'm writing from the perspective of an artist and trying to think about what do I do to make art and what can I propose or what ideas might be useful to other people in making art. So I look at those transitive color poetics in different works, but you're asking about embodied knowledge of survival. Yeah, I mean, I think that's evident in a number of these works. So like with Maddie Bryce's game, My Nietzsche, she she made this game about her daily experience, and in the game it's like minute details of your morning routine. You get out of bed, which shoes do you choose to wear, do you choose to wear makeup, do you choose to shave, do you what are the things that you do in the morning. Specific little details are in that game. And then it's about how, not do you walk down the sidewalk, but how do you walk down the sidewalk, where do you go on the sidewalk. And but what was really interesting about that game was she found that it was very widely received in a very voyeuristic way. So a lot of audiences picked it up and were like, "Oh, here's a game where that'll give you empathy for Black trans women. Play this game. In 5 minutes, you'll learn to have empathy for Black trans women." And she was disappointed, insulted, thought that was ridiculous. So she created an embodied performance called Empathy Machine that I discussed in that chapter, where she did a live performance at the NYU Game Center and used this little electronics device called a Makey to like hook up her body so that in order to play the game, you had to literally touch different parts of her body as the controller buttons. Because she thought that embodied experience might actually give people more empathy or more solidarity, even. What I try to argue for in the book is really moving beyond empathy, which is like, I don't really care if people quietly feel something. I mean, as an artist, I care quietly. I do care a lot if people quietly feel something. As an activist, I'm much more interested in people actually doing something. And I think solidarity is when people actually do something to, you know, help other people survive, who are not just themselves.
Are there any more questions from the audience? I put a link to your book in the chat if people are interested in checking that out. Always do not buy from Amazon. If there are no more questions, I'd like to thank Misha for joining us today. It was a pleasure having you. And as I stated before, this talk will be put online tomorrow, and I will send the link directly to all of you who joined us this afternoon. Thank you all so much, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you. Thanks, Courtney. Thanks, Tanya. Thanks, everyone.